Hello, I'm Jonathan Tobin, Editor-in-Chief of the Jewish News Syndicate, JNS.org, and you're listening to Top Story, a weekly podcast where I analyze the most important stories happening in Jewish news around the world. Each week, I will break down politics, foreign policy, and culture to provide insights into what is going on behind the headlines. Hello, and welcome to Top Story. Thanks for joining us. I'll be speaking today about events in Israel over the holidays and how it ought to influence how we speak about the debate about judicial reform and democracy. But first, I want to remind you to like this video and podcast, subscribe to JNS, and click on the bell for notifications. I also want to remind you that you don't have to wait a full week for more Top Story analysis. There is a daily Top Story podcast where I share more news and analysis with you about the most significant issues we're facing today. You can find the Daily Show under Top Story with Jonathan Tobin on the JNS channel on Apple, Spotify, Google Play, or wherever you get your podcasts. Also, you can see us on Telegram. You can find the latest news, including Top Story and other JNS TV content there by subscribing. One programming note, we will be off next week for Sukkot, but we'll be back the week after that. And now to today's program. Explaining American Jews to Israelis and vice versa has its challenges. While many in the United States still seem to think of it as a 51st state, or in recent years, thanks to the election victories of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and the popularity of former President Donald Trump there as a red state, Israel is nothing of the kind. There are shared values and a strong affinity between the two nations based on history and faith that make America and Israel natural allies. But events in Tel Aviv during Yom Kippur demonstrated that the gap between the nations when it comes to understandings about faith and rights can seem as big as the Atlantic Ocean. Simply put, it is hard to imagine Americans on either the right or the left regarding the attack on a public prayer service in Tel Aviv's Dizengoff Square as remotely defensible, no matter the context. Nor could they accept that a municipal ban on gender separation at a public event, even a religious service, could be considered legal by a Supreme Court that is supposedly dedicated to the protection of individual rights, since, by definition, such a regulation constituted a ban on public prayer by Orthodox Jews. Absent First Amendment protections of speech and free exercise of religion that Americans have generally always taken for granted, such things are unimaginable in the United States. But in Israel, the prayer service on the holiest day in the Jewish calendar, in the center of largely, though not exclusively, secular Tel Aviv, was somehow considered a provocation, aimed at allegedly intimidating secular liberals. Non-religious Israelis are no more threatened by Jews praying in their vicinity than are religious Jews by those who might choose to violate the Sabbath or go for a picnic at the beach on the Day of Atonement. In a free country, it ought to be a given that people are allowed to live as they please, so long as they do not interfere with the practices of others. Yet opposition leader Yair Lapid jumped at the opportunity to signal to his secular voter base that he too was offended by Jews praying in Dizengoff in the traditional manner and characterized the prayer service as the work of messianists who are bringing war to Tel Aviv. As it happens, the service has been held in that spot every year since the pandemic because of fear of praying in enclosed spaces. But after 9 months of weekly protests against the Netanyahu government's efforts to pass judicial reform legislation, the line between the rhetoric about preserving democracy from a tyranny of the majority, i.e. the largely Mizrahi religious and nationalist voters who delivered a clear majority of the Knesset to Netanyahu and his allies last November, and a culture war against those groups has been erased. The notion that the mere public practice of religion constitutes a coercive act that both gives offense and seeks to intimidate secular Jews seems, from an American perspective, to be both madness and a sign of intolerance that gives the lie to the protesters' claim to be defending liberal values. Still, there is context here that makes it understandable, or at least slightly so. Secular Jews can perhaps be forgiven for thinking that if ultra-Orthodox neighborhoods in Jerusalem or in other cities can be considered no-go zones for those dressed immodestly, or at least by the standards of the observant, or not observing the Sabbath, why can't Dizengoff be off-limits to public prayer? By the same token, some Orthodox Jews believe women praying in egalitarian services, or in a manner that they consider reserved for men, but which is normative among the overwhelming majority of American Jews who are not Orthodox at Jerusalem's Western Wall, is also a provocation. Is the violence and bullying that the women of the Wall, whatever you might think of their beliefs, face any better than the actions that took place in Dizengoff on Yom Kippur? And what about those instances when the space set aside for egalitarian prayer in Robinson's Arch away from the main Kotel Square are taken over by Orthodox worshippers who are intolerant of the non-Orthodox? Clearly, both sides of this cultural and religious divide lack tolerance for their opponents, let alone a willingness to live and let live in spaces which they consider solely their turf. In the short term, it may be that the only way to ensure communal peace is a sort of status quo agreement that would, in essence, divide the country between safe spaces for prayer and others for secular Jews to enjoy freedom from religion. That is hardly a solution that would guarantee individual rights, but at least it would avoid appalling scenes like those that the world witnessed in Tel Aviv this week. But that brings us back to the issue that is supposedly creating such turmoil and worries about the threats to democracy, the effort to rein in the out-of-control power of the Supreme Court. The argument most frequently heard about the judicial reform proposals tend to rest on the idea that without a Supreme Court with untrammeled power to intervene in virtually any dispute or any issue, even without it being a question of interpreting the laws or solely on the basis of what the judges think is reasonable, is that absent such a juristocracy, individual rights will be trampled by the Knesset and the executive branch. That's the rationale behind court rulings that guaranteed the right of the women of the Wall to pray in a non-Orthodox manner at the Kotel, though the beneficiaries of their ruling have found it difficult to exercise it absent adequate protection from the police or a willingness on the part of the authority running the area to respect the decision. But when it came to those who wished to pray in the traditional manner in Dizengoff, the very same court had no interest in defending the rights of the individual. In Tel Aviv, the prerogative of the municipality to enact a regulation that, for all intents and purposes, banned public Orthodox prayer was considered eminently reasonable. At the Kotel, the rights of the individual, or even a group, to flout the traditions of the Kotel Plaza, which treats the area as an Orthodox synagogue rather than as a national shrine, were treated as preeminent. Yet in Tel Aviv, the court made no bones about its belief that prohibiting any practice it considered inherently discriminatory, even if it is normative religious practice in Israel, where the non-Orthodox are a tiny minority, is more important than the rights of those practicing their faith. Like so many other examples of the court's activist practices, which have enabled left-wing administrations while seeking to hamstring Netanyahu's government with impunity, there is no consistency or really any principle on display in the court's conduct. This betrays the upsetting and demoralizing truth that rather than an objective defender of rights, the court is merely a bulwark of the secular left and its traditional Ashkenazi elitist base. Those who care about Israel must hope that the disgusting images in which those crying democracy defended it by preventing people from praying won't be repeated. At this point, the notion that it is only a coercive religious right that threatens the freedoms of the non-religious, and not the other way around, can no longer be reasonably sustained. Those who claim that Netanyahu is a proto-authoritarian for seeking to establish some checks on the power of the court must think seriously about how the judiciary's hypocrisy when it comes to supporting bans on public prayer undermines their case. Just as important, those who claim that those crying democracy are somehow defending a truly liberal cause must also rethink valorization of this movement that seems more intent on suppressing their opponents' rights than defending individual rights of all Israelis. Let us hope that both the courts and Israelis on both sides of the political divide will treat the events in Tel Aviv as a reason to ratchet down their rhetoric and to seek compromise rather than to destroy their opponents. Just as important, those who love Israel, who are looking on these events from abroad, should also realize that their efforts to delegitimize Israel's elected government are not as righteous a cause as they may have thought. In this context, their support for democracy may not mean what they think it does. Thanks for joining us. Please remember to tune in every day for Top Story Daily Edition, and whether you're listening to us on Apple, Google Play, Spotify, or any of the other podcast platforms, or watching us live on Facebook or Twitter, or on the JNS YouTube channel, please like and or subscribe to Story. Click on the bell for notifications and give us good reviews. Please write to us at editor@jns.org and let us know where you listen or watch the show and what you think about it. We'll be off next week for Sukkot, but back the week after that. And remember, keep reading and thinking for yourself, and we'll see you again soon.